The summer my neighbor Carol lost her entire sweet corn patch to deer, she called me on a Tuesday morning sounding like someone had stolen her car. She had planted 2 long rows of peaches and cream, babied them through a dry June, hand-watered them every other evening when the municipal restrictions let her, and watched them reach silking stage right around the time a brutal August heatwave settled over the valley and refused to leave. The deer, which had largely ignored her garden all spring, suddenly appeared with a frequency and a boldness that shocked her. They were not grazing casually, they were stripping. She found the corn one morning reduced to a field of ragged green stalks, cobs half chewed and scattered like debris. The raccoons had taken what the deer left. The groundhog had cleaned up after the raccoons. In 2 nights, 3 weeks of careful work had simply vanished. What struck me when she described it was the timing. Not just that it happened, but when it happened. The heatwave had arrived around the same time her corn reached peak sugar content, and a prolonged dry spell had tightened up natural food sources across the whole area. The creek bed behind her property had dropped to a trickle. The meadow grasses had gone dormant and brittle. The wild berry canes that normally produce through late July had fruited early and finished 2 weeks ahead of schedule because of the heat. Everything the local wildlife population depended on for late summer calories had either dried up, fruited out, or become so water-stressed it was no longer palatable. Her sweet corn, irrigated and green, and absolutely bursting with sugars under heat stress, was the most attractive food source within a considerable radius. She had not simply grown vegetables. She had grown a beacon. I have seen this same dynamic play out in my own garden and in the gardens of people I have worked with for years. Wildlife pressure in drought and heat conditions is categorically different from ordinary garden pest activity. It is not a nuisance problem. It is a survival response. When the landscape dries out, the behavioral patterns of deer, raccoons, groundhogs, rabbits, squirrels and birds change in ways that most garden advice completely fails to address. Animals that normally range widely and sample broadly begin to concentrate their activity. They return to reliable water sources repeatedly. They fixate on high moisture, high sugar food, rather than ranging for variety. Their willingness to enter spaces they would normally avoid, including fenced gardens, daylight hours, and areas close to human activity, increases dramatically because the cost-benefit calculation has shifted. The risk of the unfamiliar becomes worth taking when the alternative is going without. The standard advice in this situation is almost always about barriers. Build a taller fence, add another layer, put up a motion sensor, spray repellent. These are all reactive solutions. And they are not wrong exactly, but they miss the larger picture entirely. The reason your garden is being targeted while your neighbor 2 streets over with the same fence and the same plants is barely being touched often has nothing to do with fence height. It has to do with the relative attractiveness of your garden as a food and water source compared to everything else available in the landscape. And that is something you have enormous control over, not by making your garden less productive, but by making it productive in ways that change the dynamic entirely. The wildlife problem in your garden during drought and heat is not a fence problem. It is a design problem. The approach that most people take, which is to grow a concentrated collection of the most nutritionally attractive possible plants, and then try to physically exclude every animal from accessing them, is fighting a war of escalation that gets more expensive and more frustrating with every dry summer. The approach that actually works treats the garden as part of the landscape rather than as a fortified island within it, uses plant selection and placement to reduce the garden's relative attractiveness compared to designed alternatives, and addresses the underlying resource scarcity that is driving the pressure in the first place. Let me start with the single most important thing I can tell you about wildlife behavior during drought, because everything else builds on this. Animals under heat and drought stress are not primarily hungry. They are thirsty. The need for dietary water in many species spikes dramatically when ambient temperatures climb and natural water sources contract. Deer, for example, can require 3 to 5 quarts of water per day under normal conditions. During a heat wave, that requirement can roughly double. When creeks drop and ponds shrink and dew evaporation accelerates before it can be lapped up, Animals are not just looking for food, they're looking for water, and high-moisture vegetables and fruits are a simultaneous solution to both problems. This is why a drought-stressed garden with drip irrigation running gets hit harder than it did in wet years. The presence of water, even just a soil moisture visible through plant turgidity and green leaf color, is itself an attractant. Understanding this changes your strategy completely. Instead of only trying to keep animals out of the garden, you redirect their behavior by providing water access in a location you control, at a distance from your most vulnerable crops. As part of a deliberate landscape management approach, a simple stock tank or large water trough placed at the edge of your property away from the garden, consistently refilled during dry periods, changes the movement patterns of deer, rabbits and raccoons, enough to reduce garden pressure measurably. You are not trying to attract more animals to your property. You are acknowledging that the animals already living in your surrounding landscape need water, will find it somewhere, and can be redirected to find it somewhere that is not your sweet corn. This works best when combined with what I call a buffer planting strategy, which is the second major element of an effective drought and heat wildlife management system. The logic is the same as with the water. Rather than relying entirely on exclusion, you plant a zone between the wild landscape and your high-value production garden that provides food animals want, but that you are less concerned about losing. Native fruiting shrubs are the ideal buffer material because they produce in ways that align with natural foraging patterns. They tolerate the same drought conditions driving the wildlife pressure, and they establish and maintain themselves with minimal intervention once they are past the first growing season. Serviceberry, which is Amelanchier alnifolia and its close relatives, is one of the most effective buffer plantings I know for this purpose. It fruits in early to midsummer, precisely when natural food sources are becoming stressed, which means it captures foraging pressure during the period when it is highest and redirects it away from your main garden. The berries are high in moisture and sugar content, making them genuinely competitive with garden vegetables as an attractant. Serviceberry grows across a cold hardiness range from Zone 2 through Zone 9 depending on the species. Tolerates drought once established because it evolved across the dry western prairies and mountain edges of North America, and produces reliably even in poor soils at a pH range of 5.5 to 7.5. A mature plant will produce 5 to 10 pounds of berries per season. Plant them 8 to 12 feet apart in a loose, irregular row along the property boundary closest to where wildlife enters your space. Wild plum, specifically Prunus americana, serves a similar function and fruits slightly later, which extends the buffer period into mid to late summer. It grows in zones 3 through 8, tolerates clay and sandy soils equally well, asks almost nothing in terms of amendments or irrigation once the first year is past, and produces fruit that deer, raccoons, squirrels, and birds all find extremely attractive. The sour, astringent quality of wild plum fruit that makes it less appealing to humans than cultivated plums is actually an advantage in this context, because it makes the fruit useful as wildlife feed without being so desirable that you resent sharing it. Spacing is 10 to 15 feet in a naturalized hedge arrangement. Let them sucker and spread slightly, rather than trying to maintain formal spacing, which creates a denser, more visually solid barrier. Elderberry, which is Sambucus canadensis, belongs in every drought and heat wildlife management strategy I have ever put together, and it belongs there for several reasons, simultaneously. It produces fruit in the late summer window, when wildlife pressure typically peaks. The berries are favored by birds and small mammals, but not strongly by deer, and the plant itself is so aggressively drought-adapted and fast-growing that it fills a buffer role within 2 seasons of planting. Elderberry grows in zones 3 through 9, tolerates wet or dry soil, produces impartial shade, and can be cut nearly to the ground and will regrow from the roots without setback. A pair of plants needed for cross-pollination will produce 10 to 15 pounds of berry clusters per season once mature. Plant them 6 to 8 feet apart in the buffer zone with the understanding that they will spread by root suckers over time, which is a feature rather than a problem in this role. Now, while you are building the buffer and managing the water, you also need to be thinking about what you are growing inside the garden and how you are growing it. Because not all high-value vegetables present the same risk profile during drought, And adjusting what you grow and when you grow it during heat events changes your loss exposure dramatically. The single highest risk crop category during heat and drought is high moisture, high sugar crops at peak maturity that are grown in a concentrated block. Sweet corn is the canonical example because it combines peak sugar, high water content, a distinctive and powerful scent that carries on heat-stressed summer air, and a harvesting window that lasts only a few days before quality degrades. Cantaloupes and muskmelons have the same problem. Ripe tomatoes left on the vine in quantity trigger similar behavior in raccoons and groundhogs. The vulnerability is not the crop itself. The vulnerability is the combination of peak attractiveness, concentrated quantity, and extended exposure window. The management response to this is what I call staggered maturity and prompt harvest. Instead of planting a large block of sweet corn all at once and having 200 ears reaching silk at the same time, I plant in 3 succession plantings, spaced 2 to 3 weeks apart, keeping each planting to the quantity I can actually harvest and process within a day or two. The total production is the same. The peak attractiveness window for any single planting is compressed from weeks to days, which dramatically reduces the opportunity for wildlife to key in on the crop and establish a feeding pattern before harvest is complete. Prompt harvest is not optional during drought and heat events. Whatever you would normally allow to sit on the vine for an extra day or two to reach full flavor development needs to come in before that point when wildlife pressure is high. A tomato that is 75% ripe will finish ripening on a countertop. A tomato that is 100% ripe and sitting in a hot garden at dusk is a raccoon dinner. Cantaloupes should be harvested the moment the stem slip is visible. Sweet corn should come off the same day you identify peak silk browning, not the next morning when you have more time. The harvest window in a high-pressure drought period is measured in hours, not days. For root crops and bulb crops, which are less vulnerable to raccoon and deer, but which groundhogs will excavate with surprising dedication during drought, the same logic applies. Onions that have fallen over and begun curing in the ground, carrots that are showing their shoulders above the soil line, beets that have been in the ground past their optimal harvest size. These are all ground-level targets for a groundhog that is resource-stressed and less cautious than usual. Harvest on schedule or early during drought periods rather than waiting for ideal timing. The structural garden protection strategies that actually work during high-pressure drought periods are different from the generic fencing advice you usually read, and the difference matters. A standard 4-foot garden fence that handles rabbit pressure in normal years provides essentially zero protection against deer that are under serious nutritional and hydration stress. The behavior changes. A deer that would not approach a fence in May will walk through a vegetable bed in August if the pressure is high enough. The fence height that reliably deters deer in normal years is 8 feet of physical barrier. That is not a guideline. It is a behavioral threshold based on the jumping capacity and risk tolerance of white-tailed deer under normal conditions. Under drought stress and concentrated animal density, even 8 feet is not a guarantee, but it is the floor, not the ceiling. Rather than recommending that everyone immediately build an 8-foot perimeter fence, which is expensive and visually impactful, and not practical for everyone, I want to describe the specific fencing configurations that provide the best protection per dollar and per effort. The double fence system is the most effective for deer specifically. 2 4-foot fences set 4 feet apart create a spatial barrier that deer almost universally refuse to attempt because deer jump high or far but not both simultaneously in an enclosed approach. The outer fence can be simple welded wire or even string lines that provide a visual cue. The inner fence needs to be physically solid. Together they create a corridor that deer perceive as a trap and will not enter even under significant pressure. The total cost is lower than a single 8-foot fence, installation is easier, and the effectiveness against deer is comparable. For raccoons, the electric fence strand at the top of a standard garden fence is by far the most cost-effective deterrent available. A single strand of electric fence wire, run 8 to 10 inches above and outward from the top of a 4-foot wire fence, powered by a basic solar fence charger, stops raccoon entry almost completely. Raccoons are climbers and a static fence of any height will not deter a motivated raccoon. The electric strand changes the approach entirely because it delivers an aversive experience at the point of entry rather than simply presenting a physical obstacle the raccoon can overcome with effort. Set the strand at the outer angle during the weeks surrounding corn silking and tomato peak season. The rest of the year, you can leave it in place or fold it down. It will not matter. Groundhogs require a buried fence approach that nothing else matches for effectiveness. An L-shaped fence footer, meaning a fence that is buried 12 inches straight down and then turns outward horizontally another 12 inches underground, creates a physical barrier that groundhogs will not excavate through. They dig down and then forward to get under a standard buried fence. The outward turning footer sits in their path when they hit the bottom of the vertical section, and they will not continue past it. This installation is labor-intensive, but it is a one-time fix that lasts decades. Pair it with a fence height of at least 3 feet above ground, because groundhogs will climb a surprisingly low fence rather than dig if the fence has an accessible top. For rabbits, any buried fence with a 12-inch underground section and 2 feet above ground is adequate. Rabbits rarely attempt anything more than ground-level entry. The drought consideration for rabbits is that they will chew through irrigation tubing and drip emitters when seeking water, which is a secondary damage pattern that catches a lot of gardeners off guard. The solution is to cover the main supply lines with a layer of soil or mulch rather than leaving them exposed above ground. Emitters can be wrapped with a small section of aluminum window screen secured with a twist tie during peak drought pressure. Birds deserve their own discussion because the management strategy is completely different from mammalian wildlife. During drought and heat, bird pressure on ripening fruit, berries and tomatoes intensifies for the same reason mammalian pressure does. High moisture, high sugar fruit is a water and calorie source simultaneously. Exclusion netting is the only reliable solution for small fruits like strawberries and blueberries. The netting needs to be secured at the ground line, not just draped loosely, because birds will work under loose netting with no hesitation. A properly installed cage of half-inch hardware cloth or purpose-built fruit cage netting, secured with landscape staples at the soil level and supported with stakes or hoops above, provides complete protection. For tomatoes, individual fruit bags made from floating row cover material, tied over clusters before color break, dramatically reduce bird and squirrel damage without affecting ripening because the bags pass light and air. Cut row cover into 12-inch squares, wrap around a cluster of green tomatoes, just beginning to show the first blush of color, and tie with a twist of the fabric itself. The fruit inside will ripen fully within the bag and will be untouched. This sounds labor-intensive, and it does take an afternoon, but the loss rate on uncovered tomatoes during a drought year with high bird and squirrel pressure makes the time investment worth making. Squirrels are the wildlife management problem that frustrates people most during drought because they are agile enough to defeat almost any barrier that is not completely enclosed. They will climb fence posts, walk fence lines, and drop into garden beds from overhanging branches with an ease that makes static fencing nearly useless. The solutions that work are branch clearance, meaning keeping any branch that overhangs the garden trimmed back at least 8 feet from the garden perimeter so they cannot use them as launch points, motion-activated deterrents that use sound or water spray, and the same prompt harvest approach described above. Squirrels fixate on crops at the peak ripeness moment. Harvesting a day ahead of peak removes the target before they find it. Now I want to bring all of these elements together into the systems-level argument that makes each individual strategy more effective than it would be operating alone. Think of your property during a drought and heat event, not as a garden you are defending, but as a landscape node within a larger wildlife territory. Animals move through your area on regular routes shaped by water, food, shade, and cover. During drought, those routes compress toward reliable resources. And the routes run through your property because you are irrigating and growing high-value food in a landscape that is otherwise dried out. The question is not how to make your property impenetrable. It is how to reshape those routes so the animals pass through or past your property in ways that do not cost you your harvest. The outermost layer of the system is the buffer planting zone. Serviceberry, wild plum, and elderberry planted along the most active entry points establish a food resource that animals encounter before they reach the garden. These plants are maintained on a benign neglect approach during drought. You are not irrigating them, not protecting them, and not harvesting from them in a way that reserves the crop for human use. They exist to intercept foraging pressure and to signal through their presence that this edge of the landscape is productive. Just inside the buffer zone is where the water redirect strategy operates. A stock tank or large trough placed between the buffer plants and the garden perimeter keeps animals at this outer zone rather than pushing them inward seeking water. Fill it every 2 to 3 days during drought. This is a small water commitment that pays disproportionate dividends. The garden perimeter itself is where the structural protection sits. The double fence or electric-topped fence for deer and raccoons, the buried footer fence for groundhogs, the secured netting for bird-targeted crops, these are not intended to hold against unlimited pressure. They are intended to make access to the garden require more effort than foraging in the buffer zone does. When the buffer zone is productive and water is available outside the fence, the garden fence does not need to be perfect. It needs to be good enough that the return on effort of bypassing it is lower than the return on staying in the buffer zone. Inside the garden, the staggered planting schedule, the prompt harvest timing, and the individual fruit protection techniques reduce the peak attractiveness window of any given crop to the shortest possible span. The garden never goes from low interest to irresistible. It maintains a moderate profile throughout the season because the moments of peak vulnerability are compressed and managed. The system, understood as a whole, is not about maximum exclusion. It is about habitat management. You are managing your property as a designed landscape that redirects wildlife behavior rather than fighting it. Every drought year makes the buffer zone more established, the water redirect more habitual for local populations, and the whole system more effective. The first year requires the most active management. The third year runs largely on its own. Now here is the reframe that matters. The drought is not your enemy. The drought is the condition that eliminated your competition. Every uncultivated food source in the landscape has dried up or finished early. Your irrigated garden is the most productive spot in the territory. That is not a problem to solve. That is a leverage point to build from. When you redirect that productivity deliberately, using buffer plantings and water points to shape animal movement rather than just trying to exclude animals entirely, you are not compromising your harvest. You are using your advantage intelligently. The wildlife pressure is not evidence that something went wrong. It is evidence that your garden works. A garden that attracts no wildlife during drought is either producing nothing or surrounded by an $8,000 perimeter of infrastructure. Wildlife pressure means you have built something genuinely productive in a landscape that is struggling. What the pressure tells you is where to add the next layer of management, not whether to give up on the system. The heat is not robbing your plants of quality. For the right crops in the right management system, heat is the event that concentrates sugars, accelerates maturity, and compresses the harvest calendar in ways that make intensive production more efficient, rather than less. The drought stress that triggers wildlife pressure also triggers early maturity in many crops. A tomato that would take 4 more days in mild weather might take 2 days in a heat event. Your harvest window accelerates, which means your exposure window shortens, which means prompt harvest during a heat wave is not just good wildlife management. It is better produce. If you are dealing with intensified wildlife pressure this season and the specific animals hitting your garden, whether that is deer stripping your corn at silk, raccoons devastating your ripe melons, groundhogs excavating your root crops, or squirrels dropping into your tomatoes from above, I want to hear the specific details of your situation. Drop your general location, what crops are getting hit, and what animals you are seeing in the comments below. I will respond with specific recommendations based on your actual conditions rather than generic advice. The system in one sentence. When you manage your property during drought and heat, as a designed landscape rather than a defended island, combining a buffer zone of native fruiting shrubs to intercept foraging pressure, a water redirect point to anchor animal movement outside the garden, Layered structural protection calibrated to the specific species you are managing, staggered planting and prompt harvest to compress your crop vulnerability windows, and individual fruit protection on your highest risk crops at the most critical moments. You stop fighting a war of escalation and start running a system that gets more effective with every dry summer that passes.